The ancient footprints that changed human history. For thousands of years, they were invisible. Buried beneath the white desert of New Mexico was a trail left by people who were never supposed to have been there. No city. No monument. No bones. Only footprints. Some belonged to adults. Many belonged to teenagers and children. One trail appears to show a person carrying a toddler for almost a mile, occasionally placing the child on the ground before lifting them again. Nearby, enormous mammoths crossed the mud. Giant ground sloths turned to confront human pursuers. Children may have jumped between the deep tracks left by animals weighing several tons. Then the lake dried. The mud hardened. The people disappeared, and the wind buried their footprints. More than 20,000 years later, scientists uncovered them and performed a test that produced an impossible result. The footprints were created between 21,000 and 23,000 years ago. That meant humans were walking deep inside North America thousands of years earlier than many established theories had allowed. The discovery did not simply add another date to a history book. It opened a missing chapter in the human story. A chapter written not with words, but with footsteps. Chapter 1. The Ghost Tracks. Today, White Sands National Park looks like another planet. Brilliant white dunes rise from the desert of southern New Mexico, stretching across the landscape like frozen waves. The sand is not ordinary beach sand. It is made mostly from gypsum, a soft mineral that usually dissolves and washes out to sea. But white sand sits inside the Tularosa Basin, surrounded by mountains. Water flows into the basin, but has no natural river carrying it away. As the water evaporates, gypsum remains behind. Wind breaks the crystals into tiny grains and pushes them into the largest gypsum dune field on Earth. The modern landscape appears dry, bright, and almost empty. But during the Ice Age, this place was completely different. A huge body of water, known as Lake Otero, covered much of the basin. Around its shores grew grasses, shrubs, and other vegetation. The lake attracted animals of almost unimaginable size. Columbian mammoths stood more than 4 meters tall at the shoulder. Ancient camels moved through the grasslands. Dire wolves hunted in packs. American lions, larger than many modern African lions, followed herds around the water. There were also Harlan's ground sloths. Unlike modern sloths that spend their lives hanging quietly from trees, these creatures could stand as tall as an elephant and weigh as much as a small car. Their bodies were covered in coarse hair, with small plates of bone hidden beneath their skin. Every one of these animals came to the muddy edges of Lake Otero, and every step they took left an impression. Most footprints disappear quickly. Wind destroys them. Rain fills them. New animals walk over them. But the mud of Lake Otero occasionally preserved them. Layers of sediment covered the tracks. Minerals hardened around them. The lake eventually disappeared, and the desert formed above its ancient shoreline. Thousands of footprints remained hidden beneath the ground. Some became visible only under very specific conditions. After rain, moisture changes the color of the sediment inside the tracks. Dark shapes suddenly appear across the pale surface. Then, as the ground dries, the tracks vanish again. Researchers call them ghost tracks. They appear for a short time, like memories returning to the surface before disappearing back into the desert. People had reported enormous tracks in the region as early as the 1930s. Some were initially imagined to be human footprints of impossible size. Researchers later identified them as tracks left by mammoths, camels, and giant ground sloths. For decades, only a small number were documented. Then, in 2006, researchers noticed dark shapes covering sections of the ancient lake bed. The marks were too regular to be random cracks. Some had rounded impressions made by mammoths. Others showed the twisted steps of giant sloths. And among them were unmistakably human feet, heels, arches, toes. Not stone tools that someone might have carried from one location to another. Not bones that could have been moved by water. These were direct impressions of human bodies touching the Ice Age ground. As more tracks appeared, researchers realized that white sands did not preserve a single moment. It preserved thousands of moments across multiple layers. This was not simply a path someone used once. People returned to the lake repeatedly. They walked alone and in groups. They traveled in different directions. Children followed older people across the mud. One trackway discovered in 2018 extended for almost a mile. The main footprints likely belonged to a young woman or an adolescent male. The person moved quickly across slippery ground while carrying a small child. The evidence was preserved in the shape of each step. At different points, the footprints became wider and less stable, as though the walker was supporting additional weight. The pressure shifted from one side of the body to the other. Then, in several locations, tiny footprints appeared beside the larger ones. The toddler had been placed on the ground. Perhaps the person carrying the child needed rest. Perhaps the toddler wanted to walk. Perhaps they stopped to eat, drink, or look across the lake. Then the small tracks disappeared, and the larger footprints changed again. The child had apparently been picked up. This happened repeatedly throughout the journey. The trackway also appeared to record a return trip. The person crossed the same landscape again, but the shape of the footprints suggested the child was no longer being carried in the same way. We do not know why. Maybe the child remained with another group. Maybe someone else carried them. Maybe the tracks preserved only part of a much longer journey. The answer disappeared with the people who made them. But the footprints preserved something archaeology rarely captures. An object can tell us what people made. A bone can tell us what they ate. A campsite can tell us where they slept. These footprints showed movement, weight, and behavior. They preserved one ordinary journey from a life lived thousands of years ago. But before scientists could understand who these people were, they needed to answer a more dangerous question. How old were the footprints? Chapter 2. The date that should not have existed. For much of the 20th century, one major explanation dominated the story of the first humans in the Americas. The theory was closely connected to a culture known as Clovis. Beginning in the 1930s, archaeologists discovered distinctive stone spear points near Clovis, New Mexico. Similar points were later found across much of North America. They were carefully shaped, sharp, and technologically sophisticated. The people who made them lived approximately 13,000 years ago. They hunted large animals, traveled across enormous distances, and left behind evidence from many locations. For decades, the Clovis people were frequently presented as the first inhabitants of the Americas. The traditional story went like this. During the Ice Age, sea levels dropped because enormous amounts of water were trapped inside glaciers. This exposed Beringia, a broad region connecting Siberia and Alaska. Groups of people followed animals across this landscape from Asia into North America. When openings formed between the great ice sheets, they moved south through an ice-free corridor and populated the continent. It was a simple and powerful story. But archaeology rarely remains simple. Sites such as Monte Verde in Chile produced convincing evidence of human activity from before the Clovis period. Other locations in North and South America also suggested earlier migrations. The Clovis first model gradually weakened. Many researchers accepted that humans had reached the Americas at least 14,000 to 16,000 years ago, possibly by following the Pacific coast rather than traveling through the interior corridor. But 23,000 years was different. At that time, the planet was near the coldest stage of the last ice age. Huge ice sheets covered much of northern North America. The familiar land corridor through Canada would not have provided an easy southern passage. If humans were already living in New Mexico 23,000 years ago, they, or their ancestors, must have entered the Americas even earlier. The White Sands footprints needed extraordinary evidence. Researchers excavated a trench through multiple layers of sediment on the ancient lake shore. Human footprints appeared on several different surfaces. The scientists could not directly radiocarbon date the footprints. A footprint is an impression, not a piece of organic material. Instead, they examined layers above and below the tracks. Embedded inside those layers were tiny seeds from an aquatic plant called spiral ditchgrass. These seeds had been deposited around the time the footprints were created. Radiocarbon dating produced an age range of approximately 21,000 to 23,000 years. In 2021, the results were published. The announcement immediately attracted attention around the world. If the dates were correct, people had lived in the American Southwest during the last glacial maximum, the period when the Ice Age approached its greatest extent. But not everyone was convinced. Science advances by challenging evidence, especially when a discovery could rewrite an accepted timeline. The first major concern involved the seeds. Spiral ditchgrass grows underwater. Aquatic plants can absorb carbon from water containing ancient geological sources. This creates what scientists call a reservoir effect. If the plant absorbed old carbon, radiocarbon dating could make the seeds appear thousands of years older than they actually were. The footprints might be genuinely human, critics argued, but perhaps the dates were wrong. The debate grew. The researchers needed evidence from materials that did not live underwater. They returned to the sediment and isolated pollen grains from ancient conifer trees. Unlike aquatic plants, these trees absorbed carbon directly from the atmosphere. Their pollen would not be affected by the same old water problem. The pollen was extremely difficult to work with. Individual grains are microscopic, so researchers had to separate and collect thousands of them to obtain enough carbon for dating. They also used another method called optically stimulated luminescence. Mineral grains such as quartz store energy while buried. Exposure to sunlight resets their internal clock. Once buried again, energy begins accumulating. By measuring that stored energy, scientists can estimate the last time the grains were exposed to sunlight. This gave the team an entirely different dating method, one that did not depend on seeds or pollen. In 2023, the independent results were published. The conifer pollen supported the original age. The quartz dating supported the original age. Different materials, different methods. The same conclusion. The human footprints were created approximately 21,000 to 23,000 years ago. Further geological research published in 2025 examined the ancient lake's history and provided additional support for the last glacial maximum timeline. The controversy was not magically erased. Scientists will continue testing the site, refining dates, and debating what the evidence means. That is what science is supposed to do. But by 2026, the National Park Service described the White Sands tracks as evidence that humans were living in the Tularosa Basin at least 23,000 years ago. The footprints did not tell scientists exactly when humans first entered the Americas. 23,000 years is only the minimum suggested by these particular tracks. The first migration must have happened earlier. The footprints also did not reveal which route those ancestors followed. Perhaps they crossed Beringia before the ice sheets became an enormous barrier. Perhaps they traveled along the Pacific coast using boats and shoreline resources. Perhaps people arrived in multiple migrations separated by thousands of years. The tracks cannot answer every question, but they changed the question itself. Scientists were no longer asking only whether humans arrived before Clovis. They had to ask how long before Clovis. And somewhere beneath the White Desert, more footprints may be waiting. Chapter 3: The People Behind the Prints. The dates transformed the scientific importance of White Sands. But the most powerful part of the discovery is not the number 23,000. It is the humanity preserved inside the tracks. Archaeologists found that many footprints appear to have been made by teenagers and children. That does not necessarily mean adults were absent. Adults may have spent more time performing tasks in locations that did not preserve tracks. Teenagers might have carried materials, collected resources, or moved between camps. Younger children may have followed them. Whatever the explanation, the ancient lake bed was filled with families. Some children appear to have played in puddles that formed inside the enormous tracks of ground sloths. Others may have jumped between mammoth footprints. Imagine the difference in size. A Columbian mammoth could weigh several tons. One step left around them was a pro-American Southwest while the Ice Age was still near its maximum. That means an earlier migration, a different route, or a human journey far more complicated than any single theory can explain. The discovery also demonstrates how fragile evidence can be. These footprints are not protected inside solid rock. They exist in soft sediment exposed to wind, moisture, and erosion. Some appear briefly as ghost tracks before fading. Others may disappear forever before researchers can document them. Every track is a message written on a surface that is slowly being erased. But for now, one message remains clear. 23,000 years ago, someone walked beside an ancient lake. They carried a child. They stepped through mud surrounded by mammoths, giant sloths, and predators that no longer exist. They had no reason to believe that their ordinary journey would survive longer than cities, kingdoms, and civilizations. Yet it did. Their names disappeared. Their language disappeared. Even the lake disappeared. But their footsteps remained. And more than 20,000 years later, those footsteps forced humanity to look backward and realize that our story began much earlier than we thought. Oyutiaro. Who do you believe these ancient people were? And how did their ancestors reach the Americas? Tell me your theory in the comments. Subscribe to Nightmare Panel, because the greatest mysteries in history are sometimes hidden directly beneath our feet.